Thank you so much for having me. So yes, my name is Christopher Tounsel. Um, I am an African American, originally from the Chicagoland area, um, and I am an assistant professor of history and African studies at Penn State University.
Hello and welcome to Obehi podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewafo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
My research throughout most of my career has concerned race and religion in modern Sudan. And my first book, which is entitled Chosen Peoples, Christianity and Political Imagination in South Sudan, was published last year by Duke University Press. And in that book, I really explore the ways in which people within South Sudan during the 20th and 21st centuries read Judeo-Christian scriptures to really frame their revolutionary actions against the Sudanese state. Sudan, for much of its post-colonial history, was kind of boggled down in two civil conflicts between the predominantly northern Sudanese Arab and Islamic population waging war against southern Sudanese Christians and non-Muslims who kind of identify culturally as being African. And so my research looked at the way in which, or the ways in which southern Sudanese kind of read the Bible, right, as a kind of discursive, ideological tool, right, to help fuel their wars against Khartoum.
Thank you very much for that part. That is important. Now, my curiosity, is there anything that could have led you to study the history of Sudan in any particular way? Please help me with that.
Sure. So my curiosity about the relationship between religion and violence really goes back to the attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. I was a high school freshman at the time, and immediately after the 9/11 attacks, then President George W. Bush famously framed North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as an axis of evil, right? And so the war on terror quickly became framed not just a war against a political opponent, but really one that was framed with deeply spiritual and religious vocabulary. And so I became interested in kind of what the longer history was between, states deploying these, deeply spiritual terms within the context of kind of state-sponsored conflict. And so that kind of broader interest really landed me upon the Sudan in the late 19th century, which had the person who, at least within the Victorian English imaginary, was kind of like the Osama bin Laden of their world, the Sudanese Mahdi, who famously led a kind of Islamic revival against colonialism and was framed by the British as this kind of, evil, savage person who was, leading these Islamic hordes, right, in kind of deepest, darkest Africa, right? And so he was kind of like the kind of mediated Osama bin Laden circa the late 1800s. And so I started reading more and more about the Sudan, and I was just really intrigued, right, by Sudan serving as this context where you've got Arabs and Blacks and Christians and Muslims and colonialism and post-colonialism. And so it just seemed to be this geographic context that had so many things that I was interested in. And so by the time, I was in my young 20s, I was absolutely hooked. And so that's what I've been working on ever since.
Hmm. That's very interesting. It's also very intriguing, as it were, in some part of it, no?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to believe that when people think of Sudan, they always think of maybe the Arabs, and that is probably what they know, because that is what the mainstream is telling them. They don't ever imagine that there are pyramids in Sudan, no? Because when we talk of pyramids in Africa, we only remember, in fact, they don't even use the word Africa, as if Egypt is not in Africa. Egypt is somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So
Yeah.
they never know that Sudan is actually an integral part of the African history and the human evolution, as it were. So I'm really happy that someone is paying attention to that part of the African story.
To your point about the pyramids, one of the kind of, fun facts that I share with my students of early African history is that there are actually more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt, right? So to your point, yeah, so but
Mhm.
yeah, it's and it's I really try to impress upon my students that North Africa is Africa, right? There's this very long, historically rooted, you know, attempt that is in no small way, right, connected to the history of race and racism and slavery, right, that has attempted to frame North Africa as somehow not being true Africa, right? That Africa can only mean one thing, right? But I think that's another reason why the Sudan is so interesting, because Sudan is kind of, you know, it's got one foot in both, right? It's this kind of crossroads between the Horn of Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. And so Sudan can be used to kind of, unsettle these very popular binaries.
The environment that you are truly on is very intriguing. Now, talking of the geography, I am living in Italy. We can say Italy is a European country, but it's also a Mediterranean country. It doesn't mean that it must be one, it cannot be the other, no? In the same way, they can say that Egypt is in the Middle East because that is how they define it, but it's also an Africa because that is also the African geography. So for the fact that we have a part that we call North Africa doesn't necessarily mean that it's different from Africa in terms of the culture that have evolved all these thousands of years. So of course, if it depends on how far we want to go in North Africa, there is a time that the Arab did it were it there. So anyway, we're not even going to go that part just now.
Sure, sure. Hmm.
So now, to some persons who are probably hearing about Sudan for the first time, can you give us a little breakdown of what is Sudan?
Yeah, so the Sudan, geographically speaking, right, is immediately to the south of Egypt. Um, and in terms of kind of ancient history, the Sudan, had kind of one of the earliest documented civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa, known as, Kush, Maori. And so Sudan was very much kind of a political and economic partner with ancient Egypt, despite the fact that ancient Egypt has really received, most of the scholarly and popular attention. But if we fast forward a few thousand years to the 1800s, Sudan from 1821 until 1885 was essentially a Turkish and Egyptian colony. There was a famous ruler in Egypt in the 18th century, or sorry, in the 1800s, known as Muhammad Ali, right? The second most famous Muhammad Ali in world history. But this Egyptian ruler in the 1800s basically wanted to use Sudan, for lack of a better term, as a slave colony, right? This enormous region to basically capture slaves to fill his armies. And so the Sudan has, really for about 60 years in the 1800s was a colonial state, right? But in the late 1800s, a particular man, Muhammad Ahmed, claimed to be the Islamic Mahdi, right? This kind of millenarian figure who would bring about freedom from oppression. And so he famously casts out the Turco-Egyptian regime. But in 1898, the Union Jack, right, in the name of kind of, avenging the death of Charles Gordon, and bringing, Christianity, commerce, and civilization to Sudan, conquers the Sudan. And so Sudan was, for all intents and purposes, a part of the British Empire from 1898 all the way to independence in 1956. One of my favorite things to do as an Africanist is to push against this notion of Ghana being the first post-colonial sub-Saharan African state, because Ghana becomes independent in 1957, Sudan becomes independent in 1956, right? January 1st, 1956. And so there's a whole reason why people kind of focus on Ghana and not Sudan, but that's a completely different story. But socially or demographically, Sudan, used to be an extremely long country with respect to kind of going from Egypt to the north all the way to Uganda in the south. And so most of northern Sudan's population is of Arab culture and of the Islamic faith. Much of southern Sudan, and by that we're really talking about the lower third of the country, is not Muslim and identifies kind of culturally as Black and African, right? And so when Sudan became independent in 1956, national power was really headquartered in the north. And so there were lots of conflicts between the north and south. Two civil wars were fought between the two regions. And famously, after the second civil war between North and South ends in 2005, it was agreed that South Sudan would have an opportunity to vote, right? Whether to stay in the Sudan or to break off and form their own country. And so that vote was held in 2011. Southerners overwhelmingly voted for secession. I think the number was 98.3%. And so in July of 2011, South Sudan emerged onto the world stage as the world's newest nation, right? So it's kind of a misnomer, right, to say South Sudan is 10 years old, because, Sudan, like all parts of the world, has been part of history, for all time, right? So it didn't just kind of emerge out of a vacuum, right? But in terms of being its own internationally recognized nation state, South Sudan is about 10 and a half years old now.
Christianity and political imagination in Southern Sudan. What exactly are we talking about here?
Absolutely. So really what I talk about in my book is the way in which South Sudanese political actors have kind of inserted themselves into the Bible in really interesting ways, right? When I was in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, in 2012, when South Sudan celebrated its first anniversary of independence, I had the chance to attend a ceremony in which there were, several government officials. Former Archbishop Desmond Tutu attended, And so I was really intrigued by the way in which the speakers at this ceremony used biblical language, right? One referred to, the country crossing the proverbial river, right? The president of South Sudan today, Salva Kiir, is colloquially known as a Joshua, right? While SPLA leader John Garang was known as Moses, right? The initial national anthem for South Sudan referred to the country as a land of milk and honey. And many people in the country believed that a prophecy from the book of Isaiah, chapter 18, actually predicted South Sudanese independence. The prophecy from Isaiah 18 refers to the people of Cush, Cush, and the prophecy talks about this people basically going through a time of oppression, but then, God finally delivering them and the people presenting gifts to God on Mount Zion, right? This prophecy was so popular among South Sudanese that Vice President Riek Machar even proposed that a pilgrimage be made to Israel, right, in order to bring this, several thousands-year-old prophecy to fruition. And so in my mind, learning about this, I'm like, I wonder what the longer history of this is, right? And so as an historian, right, it was a joy for me to really dive into the archive and, read private correspondence and colonial newspapers and speeches and things like that. And the argument in my book, right, is that South Sudanese have long seen themselves as a kind of chosen people, right? Chosen in the same vein that the people of Israel in the Bible, right, were known as God's chosen people. And with that chosenness came political consequences. So for people in South Sudan to claim chosenness meant, well, look, we may be on the kind of socio-political margins of Sudanese statecraft, but because we are a chosen people, right, we are, seen by God, we are special in God's sight, and God is going to providentially work out our political liberation from our oppressors, right? And so chosenness in this way comes, not just with the kind of religious component, but a very practical political one as well. And so God was approached not just as, a kind of, unseen, all-powerful entity, but really as a political actor, right? Literally working, in South Sudan in terms of, protecting people from harm, right? Protecting people during their flights, to say Congo or Uganda as refugees, right? And something I talk about as well, right, is the fact that lots of times in South Sudanese discourse, those who were chosen were not described as being Arab or Muslim, right? And so implicitly, this idea of chosenness by God was connected to religion and race, right? And so what are the consequences of saying that God's chosen people are Black, right? How does that kind of affect how people see their state and their role in the state? So that's kind of what the book means by Christianity and political imagination.
Me, I never really knew God was this political. So he go around and start choosing people, those he want to punish or those he want to save. Of course, this fall into the politics of religion quite correctly. But what really is the explanation among the ordinary people that God has chosen them, and this God was not powerful enough to set them free, and they have to suffer all this while before they could finally free themselves, and they have to thank God for it? I'm trying to understand how we manage to explain this to the people so that they can understand it, that it is really the hand of God in what is happening to them.
Absolutely. And that is a very important question and actually sheds light on something that I think is definitely worthy of discussion, which is to say, right, did people actually believe this in their hearts? Or was this a kind of discursive strategy, right? So, what my book basically argues is that I think that both are true, right? I was able to examine, private correspondence, right, where people are conveying these kinds of thoughts about, God put, a shield between me and the soldiers that were between me and kept me from harm's way, right? Um, but then also, right, there are examples where there's a lot of skepticism, right, where people are like, well, how can the SPLA be, invoking God, right, and kind of framing themselves as a, suffering people at the hands of Muslims when they themselves are also perpetrating atrocities, right? Um, and the fact that South Sudan, since achieving independence in 2011, right, has been, well, from 2013 until 2018, was embroiled in its own civil conflict, right? Some people have been saying, well, were they really Christians to begin with, right? How can someone kind of, wear this, mantle of being, a chosen person, right? A kind of noble, chivalrous Christian, fighting to free people from oppression, right? And then once independence is achieved, become a corrupt politician, right? It's kind of tough to reconcile those two things. And so I think that you are right, in that there are people who arguably used the language of Christianity to kind of, justify their own personal political interests, right? And that is something to be pointed out and critiqued. But then there's also a long history, right, of people who truly did believe that, in a context of war and famine, slavery, right, um, sexual violence, right, that God was on their side in the midst of it all, right? Um, and so there, I think, is a history of co-optation of Christianity for self-serving interests, but I think also an embracing of the faith as a kind of instrument to help people get through and to overcome in the midst of extraordinary difficulties.
Thank you very much for that. Another thing that I was also reflecting on in the book is the way you refer to South Sudanese intellectualize the term Judeo-Christian to propagate their war. I don't know, for people who have not read the book, if you want to say something there as to how they managed to create this image in the mind of the people. So I don't know if you want to further expatiate that part.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the most exciting things that I argue in the book, right, is that um, the South Sudanese who were involved in kind of the project of religious nationalism were a very diverse lot, right? So we're not just talking about kind of ordained clergy, right? But we're talking about soldiers, um, mission school students, right? Um, Newspaper contributors, right? People who are both schooled and people who, might not be necessarily theologically trained, right? But are still, using sources like the blogosphere, right? Facebook, Twitter, right? To kind of, disseminate their own views and interpretations of how scriptures, might shed light on contemporary circumstances, right? So practically speaking, I think one way to answer your question is in terms of, print sources that are circulating. So the SPLA, for example, had its own propaganda newspaper that was actually published out of Kenya, but was sent throughout the world, right, to places like Germany, the UK, the US, Australia, right? And in this propaganda newspaper, you would have certain poems that really spiritualized the conflict between Khartoum, right? Whether, you had Omar al-Bashir, right, described as, Satan, right? This one man out of Germany wrote this very long editorial in which he equates the Civil War with spiritual warfare, right? And so he looks to the writings of Paul to say, look, this is what spiritual warfare means in this context today, right? So print culture was huge, right, in this, but then we also know that there were kind of non-print ways, right? Whether it was soldiers in the 1960s, sewing crosses on their uniforms, right? Whether you had spears being blessed, right? A very famous Catholic priest, Saturnino Lahure, who is seen as really kind of like a saint-like figure today, actually takes up arms, right, as a priest to fight for the Southern cause and gets killed, right? Now, he's a very rare case, right? It's not that there's a long history of people of the cloth in South Sudan taking up arms, yet and still he is one very famous example of that, right?
Anyway, people don't ask a question. So what I'm going to ask you is, how much role does ignorance play in situations like this, where we use God to justify political moves? This is not only happening in Africa, they happen in many parts of the world.
Yeah, so, very good question. And to your point, a very timely one. And I think that, my US context, right, is a really kind of good example of how dangerous, right, ignorance can be in terms of people, appropriating God or Jesus into the political sphere. I think that the question can be answered in two ways, right? On one hand, absolutely, right? Throughout history, religion, whether it is, an Abrahamic faith or a non-Abrahamic faith, religion has been used to justify what most people would ordinarily call selfish, greedy, horrific things, right? The Crusades happened, right? Ethnic cleansings and genocides, all over the world, right, have happened, right? People used the curse of Ham, right, from the book of Genesis to justify the transatlantic slave trade, right? So on one hand, we know that there is a long history of people taking, creative license, if you will, taking scriptures out of context, right, to justify or explain away bad behavior, right? And so I do think that there is room to critique South Sudanese public officials who have, used, I'll say, a strategic hermeneutic, right, not to point people to God, right, or not to kind of, encourage a more, just society, right, but to exploit, right? There's absolutely room for that. But the reason why I'm hesitant to use that as the primary lens, right, is because books like mine show that you have people who have looked to God, right, in their ignorance, yes, to maybe understand what is really difficult to come to terms with, but also as a source of empowerment, right? And so, it's one thing if someone invokes God in a way to say, kill these people that you don't like because God told you to, you are chosen, they're not. And so therefore their lives are less, worthy, right? That obviously would be a misappropriation, and that there's lots of room to critique that type of invoking of God, right? But for the person whose, family has been killed, right? And they're on the run, fleeing from South Sudan to Uganda, right? If they are invoking God by saying, hey, this is my own kind of personal wilderness experience, but just like God was with his chosen people when they fled from Egypt to the promised land, God is with me too, and that Uganda is my proverbial promised land, and so I guess what my hope is, right, is that people walk away from my book not seeing the book as a kind of, not as a triumphant history, or one that kind of seeks to ignore the fact that, yeah, everybody in the book might have kind of different perspectives, right? But to see that it is a checkered history, right? It's not all people trying to exploit, but it's also not all ignorant people too, right? Like, you have really educated, smart people, right, who did go to, the best institutions and things, who are also using this language, And so how do we come to terms with the fact that both can be true at the same time, right? That those who are selfish and selfless are invoking the same God, right? And that the reality of one does not negate the reality of the other.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right. Is it possible that some people from outside Sudan could have been foiling this wall of division among the people? This famous divide and rule policy, if you want to call it like that, or a strategy as it is, it has always worked, and it continues to work, and it probably will continue to work. No, when you divide the people, when they are fighting, then you continue to take away their resources. No, is it possible that can be something like that? So that because there are some people who are Christians, they don't like the Muslim, they can stir up anger so that a Muslim can be attacked in the name of God, and the Muslim can do the same to attack the Christian in the name of God. Whereas what we're actually destroying is humanity in our ignorance. Is it possible that somebody from outside could have been foiling this conflict in this line?
Yeah, so great question. So I'll answer it through the lens of the role that ethnicity currently has in the country, right? So what has been really interesting in the last decade is that you have had some people at the top of the South Sudanese church, whether it was the recently deceased Catholic Archbishop of Juba, Paulino Lukudu Loro, or Anglican Archbishop Daniel Dang, right, who have said that ethnic groups themselves are created by God, right? So South Sudan has over 60 spoken languages, is one of the most ethnically diverse regions in all of East Africa, right? But in recent years, people have been killing and being killed in protection of their ethnic identity, right? From 2013 until 2018, South Sudan had a very ethnically divisive conflict between the two largest groups in the country, the Dinka and the Nuer, right? But what's emerged, right, in the last 10 years is this idea that rather than asking people to not see themselves as Dinka or Nuer, but rather to see themselves as made in the image and likeness of God, and that ethnic diversity is actually a part of that, right? And so to say that, I am a Dinka is not to, is not to say something harmful, right? To say God made me Dinka and God made you Nuer, right, means that I can respect your ethnic identity as being different from mine, but because we're all made by God, I should not use that ethnic identity as a reason to, as you say, right, divide and conquer, right? And so I think that this is a really interesting development that has occurred in South Sudanese, I'll say, political theology, right? Which for so long was one based off of liberation, right? This notion of we need to be free from our oppressors, to one of reconciliation, right? How do we live in harmony, right? The traditional oppressor has been removed from the picture, right? But how do we invoke the God that we for so long prayed for our deliverance? How do we now invite God to, to kind of bring about, social harmony in a, ethnically pluralistic society? So I think that, yes, I think that the history of colonialism, to your point, has shown that outsiders, right, namely European colonialists, often use things like, ethnic diversity to sow division, right? And that it ultimately made it easier for them to come in and take over, because if they could pit, Africans against other Africans, it would weaken both and then make it easier to colonize, right? So that history is absolutely there. But I think what's interesting today within the context of post-colonial Africa, right, is how God is being invoked to encourage peace among diverse societies. And so, what might it mean today for a Sudanese Christian in Khartoum, right, to see their Sudanese Muslim counterpart and, respect the fact that they are not of the same faith, but that are yet and still made in the image and likeness of God, right? And that difference is not something to be, exploited, right, for any type of social, economic, or political advantage.
Exploitation. It's always the name of the game. It's always very vital, though. Because now, this God that have chosen these people, this almighty God that is up there, I don't think God is responsible for all the crises that we are claiming that he is. Because, of course, by saying that God has told the European to go and attack the Arab, which lasted for, this we're talking of the crusade that lasted for, is it 200 years? that God is responsible for that. I think that would be stupid as a way of thinking. But of course, at the time when the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, called the European to arm, he was sure that he knew what he was saying. I want to believe that he was sure that he knew what he was saying. Also in Sudan, when these people said there was this written test that God was going to fulfill his whole prophecy, that he was going to liberate the Southern Sudan, I also want to believe that they knew what they were saying. I want to believe that they knew what they were saying. But now that they are free, do they say that God has set them free? I mean, is it really the will of God that is taking place here, or is it will of man?
Outstanding question, and thank you for that. A lot of times when I talk about the book, I reference the scene from a movie, The movie is entitled Exodus, Gods and Kings, and it came out, I think, back in 2014. It was produced by Ridley Scott, and it's a kind of Hollywood depiction of the Exodus story. And so there's this really compelling scene towards the end of the movie, right after they have crossed the Red Sea. You know, the Egyptians have been crushed, and right, they're on, you know, dry land. And so there's this scene where Moses sits down and talks to Joshua, right? And Moses is like, we are a nation as big as a collective of tribes, and that this concerned him. And so Joshua looks at him perplexed and is like, you know, why are you concerned? Like, the, you know, Egyptians are now in our rear view. They are defeated. We're free. Like, we're good, right? And so Moses responds to him and says, you know, we're good now, but what happens when we stop running, right? We've been running for 400 years, right? We've been praying for one thing for 400 years. What happens when that prayer is answered, right? And I think that, metaphorically speaking, I think that the last 10 years of South Sudanese history has been a type of answer to that question, right? For 100 years, South Sudanese were praying for political liberation, autonomy, right? But once it happened, right? Once the 2011 moment happened, now what, right? And so I think that the now what has been very revealing. We are seeing that, we're seeing that some people have been revealed, right, for having used Christianity for their own purposes, right? The same people framing themselves as soldiers of God, fighting on behalf of God's chosen people, have been revealed as corrupt, right? You know, we have seen, you know, the actual South Sudanese church increasingly attacked, right? This is actually a really dark moment in the history of the church in South Sudan, because the church has been under the state's increasing crosshairs, right? Freedom of speech is not something that exists in South Sudan, right? There might be freedom of the press on paper, but practically speaking, we know that, you know, journalists and people who speak out against the state have been harassed and even killed, right? And so I think that we are seeing a kind of referendum, particularly of the state, right? In terms of, well, you know, how godly or how Christian were they really? Right? Were they just hiding behind this? Were they using their faith to kind of curry support from states like, you know, the UK, the US, right? Were they kind of using the image of, you know, suffering Black Christians at the hands of, you know, Arab Muslim jihadists, right? To, you know, to attract material support to their cause, but that they really didn't care that much about kind of faith from any, you know, existential purpose, right? I think that we are seeing that for some people that this was the case, right? But I think what is really important as well, though, right, is that one of the things that makes Sudan really unique within kind of the global history, right, of people using the Bible as a kind of political, you know, script or instrument, is the fact that Sudan is actually one of the few African locations that is explicitly mentioned in the Bible, right, through the kingdom of Cush, right? So, you know, just like an Egyptian Christian today, right, can open up their Bible and see, you know, the name of their country all throughout, right? There are people who have seen themselves within Sudan as the kind of inheritors of biblical Kush, right? Um, and so, what does it mean for people not to just insert themselves into the Bible from a figurative perspective, right? Like, I can insert myself into the kind of David and Goliath story if I find myself, facing a particularly big obstacle, right? I can do that figuratively speaking. But if I'm a person from Sudan, right, living in the actual region where biblical Kush existed, and I read Isaiah chapter 18, and I, see, within the kind of, Holy Spirit inspired scriptures that one day Kush, in some undefined, undetermined future, will suffer oppression, but that ultimately, that oppression will end. How do we make sense of that, right? And so, not to play the kind of not to be evasive, right? But I guess, how can I say this? I think that the intellectual question that can be asked is it automatically unintellectual to think about or talk about God as a political actor, right? Is there any room, right, academically and intellectually in this kind of modern world that is so defined by a strict separation of church and state and public and private spheres, right? Is it completely unintellectual, right, for someone publicly or privately to talk about God acting in the political sphere, right? And how does one kind of determine that, How does one prove that, right? How does one avoid critique, right? When there are so many reasons to, right? But then how do you look one in the face who is like 100% dead, serious, and is like, I don't believe that God wants me to vote for, such and such candidate, or I believe that God is literally calling me to enlist, or I believe that this law is like unjust and ungodly. And therefore, as a person of God in this life, I need to devote my, energies and life work to making sure that that law is repealed, right? I think that these are questions that are really complicated. But, I do think that even in scripture, right, there are kind of teachings that can lead one, to kind of discern whether one is actually, following God or not, right? There's a scripture that says you will know them by their fruit, right? And so even scripture itself teaches that there will be, false prophets, right? And, people, using God's name, when they are invested in things that are not of God, right? So even the scriptures themselves, point to the fact that, to your point, there will be lots of man work, right? Lots of works of man that have nothing to do with God, and yet God being implored, right? But one has to be a person of faith, right? At some level, of course, to be able to discern, right, what is of God and what is not.
Right. To say this is a simple question and a simple answer, it would be a lie. It's a complex
Right,
situation.
right.
But we
Yeah.
are going to have to face it. Of course, we are not looking at the authenticity of the Bible or the scripture that is even being used here. We are just looking at it from the way people react to it. Otherwise, it will be a complex issue. No, it will be really difficult to say if it's even real. I think God was going to be the same for everybody, and if God is for everybody, it will be contradicting that God is political, because politics is about taking advantage of people in most of the cases.
Mm.
No, we voted the politicians, but we see that in most of the cases they do what we didn't ask them to do. But because you don't have the power to hold them accountable in most of the cases, you don't do anything about that. You can't do anything about that. So we can't say that is the will of God. It is not the will of God. Of course, God again depends on what it means to you, because
Hmm.
everybody is not a Christian, everybody is
Right,
not a
right.
Muslim.
Sure.
So if we really interpret what the Christians say is God and what the Muslims say is God and what the other people believe it is, then we will be living in confusion all the time. But if we are mature enough to see that, okay, that is what God means to you, it's okay. I accept it for you. That is what it is for you. For me, this is what it is for me. If we are mature enough to understand that it is a personal thing, then we can live in peace. I can understand that, okay, you just saw God last night. That is cool. I didn't see him last night, but I'm still real. I'm still a human being. I'm not going to kill you because you saw God last night. So I'm not even interested how it happened. I want to think that it is your right to see God last night. So no problem. But if I want to force you to believe that I see God last night, then there's going to be an issue. Because now it becomes very complicated. All right, now
Right,
this is the question.
right. Sure.
What is the central message of your book, The Choosy People?
Sure. The simple message of my book is that religion informs political action in very serious and compelling ways that need to be investigated and understood. And I think that that is a compelling argument to make in the year 2022, right? When some would say, the world is arguably more, um, non-religious and is more secular than it has ever been, right? Where because of things like the, January 6th insurrection in this country, where you had, people waving flags saying, Jesus saves while they're, you know, throwing stones and stuff, right? Or, countless other examples throughout the world, right? Whether we're talking about, you know, the Lord's Resistance Army, Al Shabaab, ISIS, ISIL, other movements in, Southeastern Asia, right? Um, Religion, I think, has had a bad name for a long time when it comes to religious politics, right? I think that there is a kind of ready assumption that anytime religion is brought up in kind of public or political spaces, it's almost always used, right, to exclude, to exploit, to oppress, to protect, privileged people and classes and things like that, right? And of course, there is a long, long, long history of that, right? And so my book is not an argument um, testifying against that reality, right? What the book is, though, is, I think, or one of the central messages of the book, right, is that that's not the whole story, right? And that there is also a tradition of religion and faith, right, having an empowering effect against oppression, right? And so what would it mean, or what might it mean, right, to seriously interrogate the public role that religion can take at the level of a single citizen, right? A single soldier, a single, you know, voter, a single student, a single MP, right? A single person just riding the subway to and from work each day, regardless of where they live, right? What might it mean to seriously examine how their faith, whatever their faith is, right? Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, any of the thousands of faith traditions, if not tens of thousands, that are practiced throughout the world, right? What might it mean to seriously examine how their faith informs how they show up in the public sphere, how they vote, how they decide whether or not to purchase a gun, right? How they decide, to blog or to tweet, right? How they decide to tune in to a particular podcast or radio station, right? And then at the largest sense, who they decide to fight, right? Who they decide to kill, who and what they decide to be killed for, right? These are micro and macro questions of enormous consequence that deserve to be examined through the lens of religion and how faith is practically deployed outside of the house of worship or the prayer closet.
I like the idea that you are not trying to contest the fact that religion has always been used as instruments of oppression. In fact, that is what it have always been used for in most of the cases. We can take, if we just begin to turn the pages of history, we see evidence highly manifested. Taking up the book of the Bible. Anyway, I'm not going to do a critique of the Bible today.
Sure.
Just leave it the way it is. Because many a time I have always said that if you acted the Bible as a film, it would be called horror film. It's too horrible, the thing that will come out from it. In fact, you will not allow children to see it. That is how horrific the pictures in the Bible are. But it's okay. That is not the conversation for today. Now, I got a kind of a line from your book. I think you said religious culture and the African diaspora, if I'm not mistaken. So I wanted to say something to the effect of religion among the African diaspora. What can you say about that?
Sure. So one thing that I would say is that, it would be irresponsible of me to paint too broad a stroke. But I think that one of the cultural unifiers or bedrocks of the African diaspora is belief in those things that are not seen, right? Whether it is belief in an engagement with the ancestors, right? Whether it is belief in certain, gods or riches, right? Whether it is belief that there is a kind of future destination, right? And that this life is not it, right? These ideas and practices are one of the kind of unifying elements that can be found throughout peoples within Africa and or the African diaspora. I think that one thing that my book argues is that, particularly if we think about religion in Africa and Christianity specifically in modern Africa, I think that there is a tendency to connect or to approach modern Christianity exclusively through the lens of oppressive colonialism, right? This notion that, these white missionaries came in on the heels of these, guns blazing, genocidal armies, and that they tried to essentially pacify these Black colonized peoples with the cross, right? And that Christianity was basically an instrument of colonial oppression, submission, that it encouraged, cultural alienation and things like that. Again, all of those are true, but it's not the whole story, right? Because the history of modern Christianity in Africa is also the history of Black Africans, using the Bible and using the kind of tenets of the faith against the colonizer, right? And so what happens if we
I'm
approach?
interested. I'm interested in that. Please help me understand that more.
Sure,
Mm-hmm.
sure. So even in Sudan specifically, right, there was at least one case where people were referenced as approaching the mission school to learn the white man's religion in order to deploy it against him, right? To learn the quote unquote secrets of the white man, right? So practically speaking, what this could mean is, right, for someone like a you know for someone like an Eduardo Manlane, right, from Mozambique, right, who went to mission schools, right. Well, if he read about, you know, everybody being made in the image and likeness of God, right, and kind of learned for himself through the Bible that all peoples are created equal and that God is love and that love is the greatest commandment, right? And then walks outside and sees, white Portuguese soldiers, treating, Black Mozambicans all kinds of ways, right? This, liberation soldier who dies a hero's death, right, had Christianity as a core part of his anti-colonial, anti-imperialist philosophy, right? So there's a way in which some people used the Bibles that were presented to them by white missionaries and instead deployed it against the colonial state, right? In terms of like a black liberation, a black liberation, the a black liberation theology, right? Someone like a Desmond Tutu, right, could not exist, right, in the way that he showed up as an anti-apartheid activist without an intimate knowledge, right, of what the Bible teaches about social equality, right? Someone like an Eduardo Manlane in Mozambique could not exist in the way that he showed up, right? And his particular political anti-Mozambican expression, right? Without the Bible. That is not to say that one requires the Bible to be an anti-colonialist, but for the mission school student who is learning, passages about biblical Israel and the Gospels and constantly being presented with examples of oppressive statecraft and then, the teachings about, God is love and about, right, like that there is a way in which these Black Africans, right, of course, had minds of their own, right? And were not just being spoon fed what to think by white missionaries, but were learning about God on their own terms, right? Reconciling the Christian God with what they already understood about who and what God was, right? And so the history of African Christianity is really about how Black Africans have used and deployed Christianity for their own purposes, right? Purposes, yes, that are connected with submission to colonial states, but also purposes that are inherently connected to the history of anti-colonial movements, right? And then post-colonial oppression, and in the case of a South Sudan, post-colonial liberation as well.
What do you think Africans in the diaspora, okay, let's say maybe in Africa, could do to sort of rekindle their history? Because you, as a historian, I want to believe that you have love for history. What do you think African in the diaspora could do to revisit more their history instead of just be, I don't want to say spoon-fed, instead of just taking this idea that have been created for them in the name of religion, using that one as a script to organize their life?
Sure. So, one thing that I can say as an African American historian of Africa is that I have had a personal discomfort with invocations of African history that are almost exclusively connected to the ancient past, right? Now, I get why that is, right? That because of the history of enslavement, right? Black peoples throughout the diaspora were hungry to look for examples of Black African glory that preceded transatlantic slavery. And so things like ancient Egypt and ancient Kush, right? Were, often used, right, as examples of, see, look, we have not always been slaves, right? We are not stupid. We are not uncivilized. And these kind of, ancient African kingdoms, Timbuktu, Mali, Songhai, right, are all examples of, African civilization, glory, self-reliance, right? Those things are true. However, I'm like, well, what about modern Africa, right? And so I think that lots of African Americans, as crazy as it might sound, are more familiar with ancient Egypt than, say, Hosni Mubarak, right? People who are more knowledgeable about, Kwame and Nkrumah, and not about, Jacob Zuma, right? So that's just a long-winded way of saying that this one African American would like to see contemporary Africa being talked about throughout the diaspora more, right? That Africa is more than the location where people were enslaved. It's more than the ancient Egyptian pyramids, as great as those are, right? It's more than, Great Zimbabwe, and right, but it's also 2022, right? That it's also the, well, soon to be the demographic center of global Christianity, right? It's also the continent that is experiencing a technological revolution, right? It's also a continent where, so many things are happening and whose um, geopolitical importance is increasing, right? And so I would like to, and this might be or might seem contrary for an historian of all people to say, but I would like people to know more about the contemporary, right? And not see Africa as this kind of place that is fixed in the, ancient and colonial past, but that is really important, influential, impressive, and critical for us today on, March the 30th, 2022.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I really appreciate that. It is important. I agree with you because we are also living in the present. We are not just in the past. The past, we needed to be able to understand our bearing. But our life is now. We are living. We are here. So it is important that we also talk about what is going on, the plan, the strategy. What have we done in the last maybe 5, 6 years? What is the plan for the
Exactly.
future? What are the, yeah, I agree with you completely. How can people find you? Maybe they want to connect with you, or maybe they want to buy your book. Please use a short moment to explain that.
Sure. So you can Google me. So my first name is Christopher. My last name is Tounsel. And if you Google Christopher Tounsel and then Sudan, almost certainly my book will come up. But you can also go to the book's website at Duke University Press. I'm also on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at C Tounsel and then the number one. And my book's title is on the, I guess, masthead. And so you can also learn about the book there.
All right, interesting. So what would be your final message in this conversation?
Sure. My final message in this conversation is religion matters, right? And we should be talking about it. We should be engaging in these kinds of discussions and debates. We should not be accepting the first or the dominant narrative, right? So whether the dominant narrative that you've been exposed to is that religion has only meant all these good things, it's also meant other things, right? If you've only been exposed to the dominant, tale of religion has done all of these bad things, well, there's also another side of that coin. But the point is that for good or for ill, we should be talking about the influence that religion has had, is having, and can have moving forward.
It really has been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening and talk to you in the next episode.